talk this afternoon is going to pick up on a number of the themes that were raised this morning. And in fact, I'm going to use some of the same objects. But I want to talk about them from a slightly different perspective. And I want to destabilize the proceedings by raising the theme of hybridity. I would like to consider this. I want to ask the question, is this of heuristic value? I must say I was relieved by Monica's initial comments because a lot of people said, that's passé. How can you talk about it? So this is a test, and I really look forward to your responses. Now, I hope that I'm doing the right thing. Let's see. This is the first time in my life I've been told, don't eat the speaker. Am I standing in the right distance from the speaker, I hope? Okay, well, I will try to keep this distance from these things. Okay, so I've prepared a talk. I'm going to read it. I can't hope to do anything quite as lively as Shinya did, but I hope that I'll keep you all awake. It's the end of a long day. And I hope I'll try to keep it fairly tight time-wise as well. So the past decade has seen many changes in the study of Japanese art history, arguably none more conspicuous than the global turn, something we could talk about more afterwards. The global turn is a development that has opened the field up to new interpretive possibilities for all periods, but I think especially for the early modern era, that is the 1550s to the 1850s. The drive to draw attention to Japan's engagements with the world at a time when it was once held to be in self-imposed isolation has generated a great deal of fresh scholarship, and we've heard some of that this morning. Scholarship on the rather complex ecology of its material, its technical, and its artifactual exchanges with East, South, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas as well. But even as the focus on the global turn has thrown into relief the entangled histories of this era, the critical interrogation of the hybridity resulting from these mutually modifying encounters hasn't figured significantly in the art historical discourse. What I want to do in this paper this evening is to consider hybridity through the lens of three artifacts: a Gujarati-style lacquer coffer made in Japan, a Japanese-style garment made on India's Coromandel coast, and swords made in Japan with hilts covered with ray skin imported from Southeast Asia. And if these are rather bewildering and combinations of geographies, it's intentional. In so doing, what I want to do is to provoke some dialogue about the heuristic value of the concept of hybridity in the context of Japan. Now, hybridity is an umbrella term that's been applied to very diverse phenomena in the biological, social, and material worlds, as well as, you all know, as a theoretical formulation that's been given particular currency in post-colonial studies, most notably by Homi Bhabha. As a concept, it may be politically charged because it's enmeshed in struggles over identity, status, and power. Bhabha sees hybridity primarily as a site of negotiation, as a site of resistance and struggle between a dominant European and a subordinate Asian culture. For him, hybridity is an enabling strategy of colonial resistance that succeeds by denying the autonomy and uniqueness of the colonizer through mimicry and the destabilizing power of incompleteness. While sharing his emphasis on the creative agency of hybridity, what I'm primarily concerned with here is not its political mobilization as an oppositional force, but rather its artifactual materializations. But I want to emphasize that by this usage, by using hybridity, I don't mean to imply the existence of a prior pure form, or that the hybrid is somehow degraded or inferior owing to its lack of a single or easily definable point of origin. So in what follows, I'm going to use the word hybrid to characterize objects that combine disparate elements, mixed or layered in visual, material, and metaphorical ways. These combinatory forms may involve different materials, substances, techniques, styles, and especially geographies. Hybridity may come about through the initial making process, but also from an object's mobility as it moves through time and space. Processes of destruction, addition, and substitution may occur at both the site of manufacture and of acquisition, and they may occur in ways that blur the boundaries between maker and user. Changes made at the receiving end, changes made at the receiving end may repurpose an article, as in the case of this Jomon-era pot refashioned as a water container for the tea ceremony by the addition of gold lacquer. And the French chest that you see on the other side, formed from lacquer panels removed from a Japanese coffer. Now, these recreations have value as documentation, interpretation, and commentary, and they open up new possibilities even as they close down others. For example, the Jomon pot can tell us about water and cooking vessels in antiquity, but it can no longer serve in that capacity. And the chest charts the diffusion and comments on the taste for Japanese lacquer in France, but not about the original form in which the panels arrived there. Further still, as sites of intersecting cultures, hybrids may function as transmitters of information, but also misinformation. For example, Murayama Churyō, writing in the 18th century, warns of a man who bought a costly imported porcelain jar and used it as a flour container, unaware that it had previously functioned as a container for water in a latrine. In deploying hybridity as a heuristic device, my aim is to step outside the often ethnocentric narratives of binary opposition, often associated with nation-state-based studies. So doing, I believe, can help to redress a tendency in some scholarship, often under the banner of Kokusaika, internationalism, to study the interregional and global cultural flows of the early modern world reflexively. In other words, only to reinscribe the primacy of Japan and its dominant discourses. This nation-state model, which I believe in any event is anachronistic in the context of the early modern era, defines itself by setting Japan in opposition to what it is not, through often unproblematized use of terms such as wakan or wa-yo, or even the use of the term namban, southern barbarian. These are all terms that I think are problematic because they are intended to mark a difference between us and them. Differences that may be far more, as we've already heard this morning, differences that may be far more nuanced than is suggested by these binaries. A genuinely global turn would acknowledge that cultures and identities are not intrinsic essences, but lived and experienced as mutually productive sites that, to quote James Clifford, give us a way of perceiving and valuing different forms of encounter, negotiation, and multiple affiliation, rather than simply different cultures or identities. Hybridity is not monolithic, but covers many different forms of cultural accommodation, and to use it as a frame, one needs to be very careful about contextualizing the subjects that one frames in this way. Because it's predicated on movement and porousness of boundaries, it's a continuously shifting and sometimes contradictory and transient state whose specific manifestations can challenge conceptions of art and design premised on principles of linearity and progress. By attending closely to the specific materials, techniques of manufacture, and uses of three very different artifacts, I want to throw into relief these complex relationships, these multi-sided processes of translation, and the many layers of association that can become encoded in a single object. And again, I want to emphasize that my aim here is not to reify hybridity, nor to suggest doing away with nation-based approaches, but rather to use the concept of hybridity as a tool to think with, a tool to think about the pluralism of the material culture in the Japanese archipelago during the early modern era. This striking coffer is a product. Is it distorted? No? Okay, I guess it's just where I'm standing from. This striking coffer is a product of multi-sided negotiations of design, production, marketing, and trade, in which indigenous and non-indigenous materials and techniques have been manipulated in very creative ways. It makes visible one of the multiplicity of local global articulations that may be materialized in a single artifact produced on the Japanese archipelago between the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but produced to accommodate the tastes and desires of distant consumers, and also mediated by people of another culture. Its large size and domed shape were developed in response to the European demand for luxury containers for travel and storage that could be put on display as well, for which purpose a custom-made wooden stand was made after the chest's arrival in Europe. The curved interior of the lid is extravagantly decorated with a hiramakie, or flat sprinkled lacquer design of two phoenixes among a meandering kudzu vine. But its most eye-catching feature is the mother-of-pearl decor resembling fish scales that completely covers the four sides and lid. These are formed from 1,500 lamella cut from the iridescent abalone shell and attached with copper rivets. The shape of the mother-of-pearl lamella and the manner in which they've been applied are borrowed, translate a style of decor typical of Gujarat, a region on India's western coast, which you can see in this map here. Gujarat was a great craft center. Goodness, something. Yes, sorry. It was a great craft center and a regular port of call for ships traveling from Europe. And in response to Portuguese demand, craftsmen there adapted their skills to make mother-of-pearl goods for the European market. A 16th or 17th century casket decorated on all sides with mother-of-pearl in the Ashmolean Museum is an example of this very prolific style of Gujarati production, and there are many, many works of this kind. In Gujarat and other tropical and subtropical regions, the turban shell was used for mother-of-pearl decor, whereas in Japan and much of East Asia, the more easily available abalone was the norm, and as you can see, they had very different lusters. The Japanese adaptation is further, let me see, I need to go backwards now. Nope. There we go. So in Japan, the abalone was used, whereas in Gujarat, the turban shell was used. But the Japanese adaptation is further differentiated from its Indian counterpart by the shape of the lamella, which look less like cusped arches, as you see here, than like overlapping fish scales or waves, which is a pattern that's very common to Japanese media, including textiles and ceramics. This suggests that although paper or actual models may have provided the skilled craftsmen in Japan with guidelines for making this chest, the craftsmen didn't passively imitate them, but instead creatively enculturated them through already familiar idioms. While the materials, forms, and styles and motifs in which mother of pearl is used with lacquer help to identify as an object as having been made in a particular place or period, the problematic term influence is really inadequate to account for the mutually constitutive nature of the process. This reductive label not only suggests a kind of derivativeness without acknowledging the degree of innovation brought to the end product, but it also fails to take into account the multi-directional networks of which it is a part. And I will be talking more about multi-directionalism in a moment. The Indian Ocean was the conduit for the diffusion and hybridization of many such artifacts, not only because of the capital available to purchase them and ship them to distant markets along well-established trade routes, but also because of the availability throughout the region of comparable materials and the know-how to work them. Besides wood and shell, lacquer and shellac were critical agents in these processes of cross-fertilization. So what I want to emphasize here is that the raw materials, the availability of raw materials, are an integral part of this process of cross-fertilization and translation. Now I'm going to set aside insect-based shellac, which was used in India, although also in some parts of South China, and focus rather on 3 varieties of liquid lacquer that were available across the East and Southeast Asian region. Lacquer, which was available in Vietnam, as has already been mentioned this morning. Thitsi, a second variety, which is available in Thailand and Burma, and Urushio, which was available in Japan, which you see being harvested here. Now, raw lacquer of these 3 types circulated interregionally throughout the early modern era, in keeping with supply and demand. And we understand a lot more about this process, this interregional process, thanks to modern technology that is being mobilized by conservators. Conservation, I think, is really changing our understanding of the way things move, because now conservators can distinguish between the sources through the DNA markers of different sources of lacquer, and they can also bring this kind of close material reading to things like pigments, to cotton. I mean, you can tell where the cotton came from and so forth. So the point that I want to make is, let me just reiterate that raw lacquer of 3 different types was circulating in through Southeast and East Asia, and that Japan depended rather heavily on raw lacquer imported from Southeast Asia during the early modern period. Now, the variety of lacquer that was used on the V&A coffer, which I showed you a moment ago, is unknown because it hasn't been tested. But recent investigations carried out by conservators using mass spectrometry have revealed the interregional nature of the raw lacquer trade during the 16th and 17th centuries, as well as the multi-sited manufacture of objects made with it. I'll give you some examples. Ulrike Kolber, who is a conservator who's based in Lisbon, has studied a number of 16th century shields. Oh, where'd my shield go? There we go. A number of 16th century shields made of leather covered in lacquer, whose manufacture involved a kind of outsourcing from India to various locales in East and Southeast Asia. You heard about these already this morning. Portuguese merchants apparently shipped partially finished leather shields from Bengal and the Coromandel coast to East Asia for decoration with lacquer and gold, and then sent them back to the Indian subcontinent where they functioned primarily as gifts. Shields of this kind appear, now if I can go back again, Shields of this kind appear in Mughal miniatures and also, as you saw earlier, in Japanese screen paintings as well. Korber's examination of the shield that you see here, which is in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, and which was recorded in the 1596 inventory of Archduke Ferdinand, has, for instance, revealed the use of lacquer of both Japanese origin, that is Urushio, and Vietnamese origin, lacquer. And Korber suggests that either that means that this was worked on in two different sites, or that one site possibly combined craftsmen of different backgrounds, or that multiple sources of lacquer were available in one workshop. But this shield is also of interest because it's covered with the skin of a ray, a type of ray that's common in the Indian Ocean, a subject that I'm going to come back to. Korber has argued that the use and decorative treatment of ray skin, as well as the style of gold lacquer painting here, point to the shield's decoration in the Ryukyu Islands. This is a proposal that she has made, and I think it's still open to interpretation. But her point is that this does not look like the kind of decoration that was being made on Honshu, but does resemble a number of Ryukyu lacquer objects. This degree of material, technical, and stylistic hybridity may be exceptional, but conservators Arlen Higginbotham and Michael Schilling at the Getty have discovered that Japanese lacquer panels. Oh, I had a map of the Ryukyu Islands. There we go. That Japanese lacquer panels adapted for French furniture, now in the collection of the Getty, were not made solely from Urushio, the variety of lacquer grown in Japan, but also included Titsi, the variety that grows in modern-day Thailand. So you've got Japanese panels using two different sources of lacquer. Combining archival research with technical research, the two conservators identified 17th century records of traders from the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, testifying that lacquer was purchased in Ayutthaya, the then capital of Siam, and shipped to Japan to supply the lacquerers who made the luxury, whoops, no, that's not what I want yet, who made the luxury goods that the Dutch in turn shipped back to Europe. 17th century records further indicate that Chinese traders also supplied Japan with liquid lacquer from, it's that hour, with liquid lacquer from China, Cambodia, and Thailand. So Korber, Higginbotham, and Schilling's research reveals that there's much more to the material history of lacquerwares in Japan than meets the eye. By disclosing that what is commonly labeled as Japanese lacquer may in fact be a composite of many substances of disparate origins, they implicitly situate these as hybrid objects, objects whose manufacture, I believe, should be understood within narratives of transcultural interdependence. Now, of course, economics was a driver of this development. Although imported Titsi was considered inferior in quality to local Urushio in Japan, its lower price made it attractive to craftsmen in Japan. And one reason that they could use it with impunity is that it could be combined with local lacquer underneath the main layer. So the top layer was Japanese, but the consumer would not be aware that a different variety of lacquer was used for the undercoats. Now, so far, Schilling and Higginbotham have only had the opportunity to test lacquer from export wares in their own collection. But there's been some very interesting work done by an archaeologist named Kitano, whose first name escapes me at the moment, and I didn't put it down here. But he has, with a group of other people, excavated a lacquer maker's shop on Oikedori in Kyoto, and there discovered large-eared jars, large tsubo, and tools still bearing traces of Thai or Burmese lacquer. So this indicates that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the use of Southeast Asian lacquer wasn't just for export goods, but was also for use for domestic goods, and therefore that these interregional connections were indispensable for local demand. This suggests that local supplies were not sufficient to meet the surge in demand for lacquer, particularly think of all the lacquered buildings that were made in the late 16th and early 17th century. So let me move on now to my second case study. So my first case study was a coffer dating to an era widely recognized for the cosmopolitanism of its material culture. My second example of artifactual hybridity, I turned to an 18th century garment that blurs the taxonomies and geographic boundaries of an era more commonly interpreted in terms of Japan's isolation or semi-isolation. This intricately patterned cotton robe speaks to the remarkable design skills and technical know-how of cotton weavers, dyers, and painters on India's eastern Coromandel coast, as adapted to the taste in Holland for Japanese-style garments. Its T-shape and absence of shoulder seams identify it as what is known in Dutch records as a, forgive me for the pronunciation, Japonscharok, or Japanese robe, a wrapper worn over shirts and breeches that became fashionable among affluent merchants in Holland in the mid-16th century. As Susan Miller's forthcoming exhibition at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum will reveal, this label, Japonscharok, covered a variety of different garments. It covered plain, patterned, or wadded silk kosode purchased in Japan, as well as cotton garments of the same T-shaped, fabricated in Gujarat, in Bengal, on the Coromandel coast, all areas that were very well noted for their quality painted and printed cottons. And I should point out that there are quite a few of these around, but a number of them have been recut. So one can talk about a T-shape, but the sleeves vary quite significantly. Let me go back. The most remarkable feature of this example, now in the Rijksmuseum, is that it was not made up of yardage cut into pieces, but rather from a single expanse of cotton, resist painted and mordant dyed in such a way that the pattern changes direction at the shoulder to produce flowering trees growing from the ground up, both on the front and on the back. Now, the integrity of the pattern is enhanced by the absence of shoulder seams. The motif of trees with intertwined flowering branches growing from a rocky ground is a very common one in Indian textiles made for export, and it's been widely associated with a Middle Eastern tree of life motif, with a Hindu-Buddhist kalpa vriksha, with wish-fulfilling tree, but it can also be associated with similar designs featuring on Japanese kosode, as demonstrated by the close relationship between the decor of a cotton robe from the Coromandel coast and a Japanese silk wedding kimono. Both of them are now in the Royal Ontario Museum. Now, in a 1960 article, Brett pointed out that the cotton robe that you see on the left here not only reinterprets the three friends motif, that is the pine, plum, and bamboo motif, but it also translates the kanoko shibori, or tie-dye technique that was used in Japan, into a kind of cross-hatch that you can barely make out on the upper sleeve. I'm afraid I don't have details. So there are multiple kinds of translation being carried out here. The transfer of this garment style and pattern from Japan to India and from silk to cotton was mediated by Dutch traders, for whom these hybrid garments arguably made visible the global range of their mercantile activities. And this picks up on a theme that was addressed this morning, I think, in terms of the reception of byobu in Mexico and why these were redeployed or made locally. I think that similarly, that suggested the kind of cosmopolitanism, kind of worldliness. The loose rectilinear structure of the kosode the Japanese-style garment lent itself well to being taken up by makers and recast in the material language of local cultures in many parts of the world. The cut of the japonshirok has much in common with the banyan, which is an informal coat worn throughout the British colonial world in the 18th century. But interestingly, the term banyan derives from a Gujarati word for merchant or trader. But like the japonshirok, the banyan, I mean, there are people who have tried to define it very narrowly, but I think it should be understood as a kind of creative reinterpretation of garments of multiple origins, of Persian origins, of Ottoman origins, of Japanese origin. So that I think it's a very difficult thing to pin down, and it's an example of sartorial hybridity. Another point I want to make here is that the T-shaped garment that we've been looking at here was occasionally worn by European women. But in the 17th and 18th century, what we now understand as a Japanese garment was predominantly part of masculine fashion. So, when we think now about the stereotype of the kimono in gendered terms, I think that needs to be complicated by its earlier history. The number of men who chose to have their portraits painted in this style of garment, I think speaks to its role in conveying its wearer's fashionable cosmopolitanism. Pepys, for example, donned such a padded silk gown to have his portrait painted, and so did Bostonian Nicholas Boylston when Copley portrayed him. And this garment was so valuable that he lists it in his inventory when he died and specified where it was to go. Although the cotton chintz garment that I began with, the one that's in the Rijksmuseum, was likely commissioned for export to Holland, there is evidence that there was also an appetite for similar painted cotton robes in Japan. Their prohibitively high cost, however, limited their adoption to very wealthy merchants who were thought to have worn them as juban, that is, as under rather than overgarments, because they were forbidden from wearing such flashy clothes. The social performance of sartorial cosmopolitanism was common among among members of the merchant class. But for the most part, this had to be materialized either surreptitiously, hence the undergarment, or else in the form of small accessories, such as purses or tobacco pouches made of small pieces of sarasa, that is the Indian-style garment that was referred to this morning, rather than by whole garments. Sarasa, the term by which Indian painted and printed cottons were known in Japan, was introduced by the Portuguese, but imports of this kind of fabric continued later via the Dutch and the Chinese, who also introduced imitations made in Indonesia and in China, fashioned expressly for the Japanese market. So again, how can you talk about these in terms of a single national origin? The inclusion of sarasa patterns and samples in many popular printed books and collections of treasured fabrics speaks to their hold on the Japanese imagination. Or I should say the imagination in Japan, since I'm trying to get away from the sort of nation-state language. The shared desire to acquire and display these vibrantly colored textiles and the hybrid garments and accessories made from them in Japan, in Holland, in England, and America arguably makes them part of a global fashion system. This might be something we could debate later on. As John Guy, Kayoko Fujita in her work, and more recently the curator of an exhibition devoted to sarasa at the Miho Museum have shown, South and Southeast Asia have contributed far more to the look and feel of early modern Japan than has been commonly acknowledged. These regions were not merely the source of sought-after printed and painted cottons, but also the driving forces behind the development of new technologies and new textile patterns again in Japan. It has been suggested, for instance, that the introduction of quality Indian mordant dyed textiles spurred the search for local mordants that could produce comparable non-fading cotton fabrics, and that the Indian printed textiles were also a catalyst for the development of Yuzen dyeing. Kayoko Fujita has also drawn attention to the popularity of the santomeshima, or striped pattern from Sao Tome on the Coromandel coast, which became hugely popular for both men and women's garments in the 19th century. For my third and final example of material and artifactual hybridity, I turn to the imported ray skin that was used to cover swords and scabbards, objects commonly identified as intrinsically Japanese. Now, in this case, I want to look at the material and the techniques used to work ray skin, but also at the discursive systems in which ray skin became enmeshed. And I want to do this to show how the cultural value of this semi-processed commodity, which actually was pretty stinky when it started, the semi-processed and not very attractive commodity was reconstructed and disseminated within Japan as something with cultural cachet. Now, ray skin and its cousin shark skin have a long history as a cover for sword hilts in China, Korea, Japan, as well as in Europe, because their textured surface and durability, even when wet or bloodied, made these aquatic leathers very well suited for covering instruments that needed to be grasped firmly in the hand. Ray skin is a very bumpy, it has a kind of pebbly surface, so it's easy to hold on to. It was also used for telescopes. It was also used for microscopes. So all kinds of instruments were covered with this. But beyond its functional properties, this tough skin was valued in Japan because of the, let me go back, let's see if you can see that, yes, because of the dorsal denticle nodules' resemblance to pearls. And for this reason, when it was used as a covering for sword and dagger hilts, the skin was often bleached to enhance its whiteness and applied so that these raised nodules, known as tsubu, are aligned with the blade. The resemblance to pearls could be further enhanced by the addition of artificial nodules fashioned from bone or horn. Now, for centuries, the use of ray skin on the Japanese archipelago seems to have been limited to swords, but the growing availability in the 16th century of much larger and more dramatically patterned skins from South and Southeast Asia. Whoops. Oh, here you see, this is a dagger that shows the vertical alignment of the ray skin along the same line as the blade. Okay, this is what I wanted to say. So the availability of much larger skins of types of ray that were only available in South and Southeast Asia, in Japan, spurred the development of many new uses for ray skin. And this is one of the kinds of ray that became very popular. Among the uses of ray skin within Japan in the late 16th century was to cover large coffers that were coffers, caskets, and escritoires that were being made for export to Europe. It's possible that initially the application of ray skin to coffers was a cheaper and a faster alternative for covering these large surfaces than sprinkled gold, makie. Comparison of the decorative treatment of the coffer that you just saw and of swords suggests some very interesting commonalities. On the left-hand side, you see one panel from the coffer that I just showed you, and you can see how in the center there is a sprinkling of ray skin nodules enhanced with or punctuated by mother of pearl in a vertical way in the same manner as sword hilts were decorated, except that these incredible patterns were created by, I should speak into the mic. These incredible patterns are not entirely natural. They've been enhanced by the addition of horn inserts. So the point that I want to make here is that while that there are some shared techniques that are involved in works made for export and works made for the domestic market. So what I'm trying to do here is problematize the label export ware and suggest that this is not, that this shouldn't be thought of as an entirely separate category. So what I'm suggesting here is that we see a kind of mutually reinforcing intersection of local and interregional materials and techniques that are resulting from global trade. The cachet and increasingly high prices of that Raiskin commanded in the Edo period were both product and producer of its impact in the making of arms and armor, which took on symbolic value as objects of competitive display rather than warfare among members of the warrior class. Since each sword or dagger hilt could require the use of one ray to create the artificial, this distinctive ridged line of dorsal denticles at its center, and members of the warrior elite prided themselves on large collections of weaponry and accessories, there was a huge demand for ray skins throughout the Edo period. Locally available species could be used, but a passage in the 17th century Illustrated Encyclopedia of Humanity, okay, yeah, here we are, or Jinrin Kinmozui, notes that imported skins from Sao Tome on the Coromandel Coast, which we've already heard about, and Champa in modern-day Vietnam, that skins from those regions were especially sought after. Furthermore, Dutch records testify that aquatic skins were among the trade goods exported from Ayutthaya, the capital of Siam. Between 1633 and 1663 alone, according to George Vinyl Smith, who's an economic historian who studied trade between Japan and Thailand, over 450,000 skins were imported from Siam to Japan. Furthermore, as entries in the... No, I don't have that. I'll go back. As entries in the Dag registers of two heads of the Dutch East India Company trading post in Deshima reveal, these often... I should have a slide. Let's see. Here we go. These ray skins often came together with other semi-processed luxury materials, including silk, buffalo horn, deerskin, raw lacquer, which I mentioned earlier, and sapanwood, which is suo, which is used to create a dye, a sort of maroon, brown, or reddish dye. The 18th century Koisegi, or Discourse on Ray Skin, authored by Inaba Tsuryo, a specialist on sword furniture, helps to expose the rhetorical mechanisms that enable the translation of these fishy commodities, these skins, into objects of aesthetic appreciation. The text, of which I've shown you a couple of illustrations so far, the text details the process through which the material was worked in order to fashion the covering for sword hilts, scabbards, as well as non-functional objects. There we go. Non-functional objects known as kazari aramazame. These are hilt-like, and I have to thank Julia Meach for this. This is something in the Metropolitan Museum. I haven't seen it myself. But these were, as the word kazari suggests, these were made strictly for exhibitionary purposes, and they're hilt-like objects, but they're never intended for blades to be put in them. They are gifts, and they're made with particularly fine skins and then covered with brocades. And down here you see the kind of models from Inaba Tsuryo's Koisegi. One aspect of this process of acculturation was the development of a hierarchical taxonomy of ray skin. In his Koisegi, Inaba ranks the skins that were being imported on the basis of their regions of origin. Skins from Champa in modern-day central southern Vietnam and from Sao Tome on the Coromandel Coast were at the top of the list. They were considered the best ones. Next, these were followed by skins from Kasuta or Cambodia, from Chamuro, Siam, from Kochi, and also Jagara. So and other places are named as well. Now, it's likely that by the end of the 18th century, when Inaba was writing, that the names of the regions from which race skins were procured, it's possible that these were a little more than conventional labels, perhaps more important for their cultural connotations and their mercantile value than their geographic reality. But I think nonetheless that these labels speak of interregional awareness as part of the appreciation of commodified difference. So it's not just us, them, but there are differentiations being made among the different regions within South and Southeast Asia from which imports are coming. This topographical taxonomy is by no means unique to this rather rarefied world of race skin, but is also shared in the world of incense, jinko, where the 5 major types of incense are also differentiated by their region of origin in South and Southeast Asia. And it's also a distinguishing feature of the tea ceremony, a subject to which I'll return in a few minutes. Now, Inaba's Koiseki is a specialist text that is likely to have had only a limited readership. But there are many references to the value of imported race skin in popular literature. I want to make the argument that although this may seem very recherché, in fact, race skin was something that loomed large among luxury goods during the period. For example, we find references to it in the writings of Saikaku in Nihonei Taigura. We find references to it in Koshoku Gonin Onna, 5 women who love love. And where race skin is listed together with other treasures in a merchant storehouse, together with karaori, Chinese textiles, aloes wood for incense, coral, imported celadon tea utensils, and so forth. But we also, in one of Saikaku's writings, we also find a very interesting description, an interesting description of the shop that is run by a race skin specialist. And Saikaku notes, the correct appearance for a shop differs according to type. If you're dealing in race skin, in books, in perfumery, incense, or silks, your shop should be decorated tastefully and have an air of spaciousness. But if you run a pawnbroker shop or a grocery store, a cramped interior and a suggestion of disorder is more suitable. Now, I think that this orderliness, this sort of sense of sort of classiness, is somewhat reflected in the neat array of the scabbards and other accoutrements in the scene on the left here from Jinnin Kimozui. So the point I'm trying to make here is that race skin was being incorporated on many different registers within the culture of the early modern era. And I want to mention another register, poetic language. Poetic language was a very important, a critical tool in the integration of race skin and many other forms of material culture into cultural regimes of value. Although its origins are unclear, the poetic kairage, or plum bark skin, was widely used to characterize race skin. But this metaphoric language also was used in other media. So it was used to describe a particular kind of crawling glaze on Edo ware. So the famous Kizaemon Tibo is often described as having a kairage glaze. So what I think is very interesting here is the way in which a poetic language becomes a transmodal method of talking about things that links them into a larger discursive system. So it was through such rhetorical means that race skin also became subject to elaborate connoisseurial evaluations through poetic language and linkages across media. It became subject to elaborate connoisseurial evaluations by specialists, meikiki. I mean, today we think of the term meikiki as referring primarily to connoisseurship in the tea world. But the evaluation of reiskin also involved meikiki. The analogy between the connoisseurship brought to reiskin and the connoisseurship brought to tea wares is made clear from this passage. I'm not going to read it because it's too long. But I think it's worth noting the word meikiki, but also the tripartite systems of evaluation, the lexicon, the close attention to details of color and grain. All of this kind of visual and material scrutiny would have been familiar to readers from other connoisseurial writings. All speak to the kind of visual and material scrutiny brought to tea ceremony utensils. So the classificatory system here, as well as the aesthetic practices associated with reiskin, are clearly informed by a cultural outlook that I would suggest developed within and was disseminated by tea culture. Novelty was critical to the ongoing vitality of the tea ceremony in the early modern era. Achieving this, of course, depended to a large extent on the discovery and incorporation into the world of tea ceremony practice of material forms of disparate origins, old, new, domestic, and imported. The flow of goods from China and Korea, to be sure, but also Vietnam, Thailand, India, and even Holland contributed to these synergies, these cultural synergies in the world of tea. Tea practitioners strategically mixed and matched utensils such as blue and white shonsui ware or enameled kochi ware from China, and types such as the so-called tuber-shaped imogashira or potato head, thought to have originated in Southeast Asia. And they mixed and matched all of these to create assemblages, toriawase, that drew attention to regional differences in materials, in forms, and in style. And within the tea ceremony as well, various imported fabrics, including sarasa and other exotic fabrics, were used to make the shifuku that were intended to hold precious tea utensils. These imports, as earlier been indicated this afternoon, these imports also generated local substitutes, import substitutes, that contributed both to the diffusion and naturalization of these types and styles of wares. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the aesthetics of the tea room, by encouraging participants to physically interact with objects of disparate origins, of the kind I've just shown, made the tea room a critical site for the socialization of hybridity. Now, reiskin was not materially present in the tea room, but what I hope I've suggested reasonably convincingly, through its taxonomy and the language of connoisseurship that was brought to its evaluation, it was part of the same discursive world. So let me try to wrap up here. So I've looked at three categories of objects, all that are commonly labeled as intrinsically Japanese: lacquer, kimono, and swords. Now these are all categories of artifacts that are taken to be intrinsically Japanese, but what I've tried to suggest that the many cross-cultural negotiations in which they were implicated in the early modern era, that this testifies that these are not stable categories. They should be understood, rather, these categories and the objects that I've shown should be understood rather as the aggregate products of the creativity, of the collective skills, of the labor, and of the consumption practices materialized through the forces of local, interregional, and global trade. The fact that outstanding examples are held in a state of permanent stasis within the museum today to represent Japan fosters a kind of a tendency to see them in essentializing terms as national symbols divorced from the dynamically changing context in which they were created, circulated, and consumed. Now, I think that the three cases that I've presented could have been augmented by many other examples. Hybrids of various kinds can be found throughout the history of Japanese art and design, and each can tell a very particular kind of story not about origins and destinations, but instead about in-betweenness. But it seems to me that accounts of their history often ignore or underplay the ambiguity of these processes of change. They underplay these ambiguities in favor of more comfortable, irreducible, unproblematized binaries that are premised on simple geographic boundaries. Anachronistic projection of contemporary fears about the effect of globalization, I think, encourages this outlook. And yet, there isn't a lot of evidence that the social values and cultural experience of hybridity in the early modern era were premised on a uniform vision of national identity or modern notions of authenticity bound up with the idea of inalienable cultural property. To be sure, the embrace of hybridity varied widely depending on locale, class, and other factors. But I think close examination of the materials, making, and meaning of many familiar Japanese artifacts would reveal the degree to which the culture of the early modern era was constituted by mutually beneficial interregional and global entanglements. Thank you.